Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we look at the items scattered across the lands between, easy to miss no matter how many times you've walked this world. Weapons and talismans and armor sitting in corners of the map that even veteran players have never laid eyes on. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight and what games you want me to cover next. And subscribe if this helps you sleep. The Cinquedea. Behind the bestial sanctum in Caelid, where the roots twist down into the earth in a series of drops most players glance at once and decide isn't worth the full damage, there is a dagger waiting at the bottom. The Cinquedea looks unassuming. A short, triangular blade with none of the flash of the weapons players chase early on. But its passive effect boosts the power of incantations while it's equipped in the offhand, making it one of the only daggers in the game built specifically to support a caster rather than a fighter. Faith builds that never bother exploring behind the sanctum are, in a very real sense, leaving free damage sitting in the dirt. The path down is narrow and it punishes hesitation, but the reward waits patiently at the bottom regardless of how long it takes you to work up the nerve. What makes it stand out even more is how rarely daggers get any love in a game built around greatswords and colossal weapons swung with both hands. Here is a small blade, easy to overlook on a character sheet, crowded with bigger numbers, quietly doing more for a caster's damage output than half the staves and seals most players default to instead. The shield nobody finishes. Deep in the same drop behind the bestial sanctum, tucked near where the Cinquedea rests, sits a small round shield with a base physical negation stat that looks almost embarrassing on paper. This is the unenhanced Dragon Crest Shield Talisman, and for a long stretch after the game's early patches, it was, quite literally, impossible to reach. An error in the game's collision caused players who attempted the drop to die instantly, sealing the item behind a wall of code rather than geography. It was eventually fixed, but by then, almost nobody bothered going back for it, since better versions of the same talisman turn up naturally elsewhere. It remains one of the strangest artifacts in the game's history, an item that was for a time mathematically unobtainable. There is something almost poetic about a treasure defined less by its power and more by the sheer stubbornness required to claim it. A talisman whose real value lies entirely in the story of reaching it, rather than anything it actually does once equipped. The beetle in the snow. Out in the consecrated snowfield, past a barrier that only opens once you've pieced together both halves of the Haligtree secret medallion, there's a talisman shaped like a scarab beetle that quietly reshapes how generous the world feels around you. The silver scarab increases the odds of enemies dropping rare items, and it does so from a corner of the map that most players only ever visit once, and only in a hurry, chasing a boss rather than a treasure chest. The medallion itself is a two-part puzzle spread across entirely different regions, which means most Tarnished either forget the second half exists or never think to double back once they have it. The beetle waits in the cold regardless, patient as anything buried in snow tends to be. And here is the thing about item discovery talismans in general. Their effect is invisible until you understand it's working, quietly nudging every kill and every chest towards slightly better odds, which might explain why so many players never bother chasing one down, even after learning where it hides. The Guilty Man's Shield. Limgrave feels like a region most players think they've fully mapped within the first few hours, but the demi-human forest ruins hide a locked chest that a surprising number of playthroughs never crack open. Inside is the Shield of the Guilty, a round shield whose passive properties reward defensive, patient play rather than aggression. It's not the strongest shield in the game by any measure, but it's a strange artifact to find so early. Buried among demi-humans in a forest, most people sprint through on their way to somewhere else. One interpretation suggests it was placed there deliberately, as a reward for players willing to slow down in a region designed to feel simple. A little test of patience disguised as a chest in the woods. You have probably ridden past those ruins a dozen times without ever dismounting, since Torrent makes the whole area feel like scenery rather than a destination, and the shield rewards precisely the opposite instinct. The talisman that punishes madness. Deep in the abyssal woods, an area of the Shadow of the Erd Tree expansion, hidden behind a fake wall at the bottom of Shadow Keep, there roams a creature called an aging untouchable that appears, for all intents and purposes, immune to harm. Most players who stumble across it simply walk away, assuming it's an environmental hazard rather than an enemy meant to be fought. But killing one drops the aged one's exaltation, a talisman that boosts attack whenever the madness status effect triggers nearby. It's a strange, narrow reward for a genuinely difficult secret, and it stands to reason that From Software buried it here specifically, because so few players would ever think to test whether the untouchable could actually die. The fight itself takes patience. Most players never spend on what looks, at first glance, like an unkillable environmental fixture, rather than a boss wearing the disguise of scenery. The heirloom of a god nobody names, above the very spawn point of the Shadow of the Erd Tree expansion, past a hidden passage along a cliffside wall near Belorat that most players never think to hug. There's a path leading up through Prospect Town to a chest at its highest point. Inside waits the outer god heirloom, a talisman tied to Elden Ring Stranger, more cosmic corners of lore, the outer gods who exist just beyond the reach of the Golden Order's story. Based on what we know from its item description, it seems to hint at forces older and less comprehensible than the demigods players spend the whole game fighting. It's easy to miss simply because the passage to reach it sits directly above where most Tarnished first arrive, close enough that nobody thinks to look up. There's something fitting about that placement too. A talisman devoted to gods beyond comprehension, hidden in the one direction the game rarely asks you to check, high above your own head rather than buried underground, where every other secret seems to live. The Blade Rani never lets you keep. Tucked in Nokron, Eternal City, an underground region only reachable after Starscourge Radahn falls and the stars themselves seem to tear open the sky, there's a blade with an oddly ceremonial purpose. The Fingerslayer blade doesn't function like a normal weapon for very long, because Rani the Witch asks for it almost immediately as part of her questline. Most players who do complete her story hand it over without a second thought, and never actually swing it in combat. It exists less as a tool and more as a key, a physical object that ties together the celestial mystery hanging over the entire back half of the game, and its fleeting time in your inventory is easy to overlook entirely. Its edge is said to sever a person's connection to the stars themselves, which, based on what the story eventually reveals about Rani's own fractured fate, makes handing it over feel far heavier in hindsight than it does the moment you first pick it up. The axe behind the false wall. Black Knife Catacombs sits west of Belurat, unassuming among the game's many minor dungeons, but tucked behind an imp statue requiring a stone sword key, is a room most players skip entirely because the door looks decorative rather than functional. Inside waits Rosas' axe, a colossal weapon carrying the name of a lost demigod whose story the game only ever gestures at through item flavor text. This could imply that Rosas was a warrior of considerable size and standing before whatever fate befell the royal family, though the game never confirms it outright. The axe itself hits like a falling building, and it's the kind of item that rewards the specific kind of curiosity that treats every locked door as a promise rather than a dead end. 2 Stonesword keys is a real cost this early in most playthroughs, and plenty of Tarnished spend them elsewhere first, leaving this particular door and the fallen prince's name attached to it sealed shut for good. The dagger that marks you an assassin. At the heart of the same dungeon, past a boss, fight against a black knife assassin that catches most first-time visitors completely off guard. A small talisman waits among the spoils. The assassin's cerulean dagger heals the wielder on landing critical hits, a reward tuned specifically for the kind of quick, opportunistic melee builds the black knife assassins themselves favor in combat. You've probably heard whispers about this order in dialogue long before you ever meet one in the flesh. Murderers in service to an unnamed master who move through the story as rumor before they ever appear as a fight. Finding one guarding a catacomb this easy to skip feels almost like catching a shadow mid-step. Gone again the moment you look away. The print left by a killer. Beside that same talisman, dropped from the same encounter, sits a far stranger item called the Black Knife Print. A key item rather than an equipable piece, tied directly to the shadowy order responsible for murdering members of the royal bloodline throughout the game's backstory. Its description hints at a connection running deeper than a single dungeon boss, suggesting this particular assassin was carrying proof of contracts fulfilled elsewhere in the world, evidence of a much larger and more coordinated campaign than the story ever spells out directly. One interpretation suggests the game wanted players to stumble across this print specifically without fanfare. A small, cold artifact proving that the killings referenced throughout the story were real, carried out by real hands, tucked into a dungeon most Tarnished clear once and never revisit. The mark left by death itself, at the very top of the Divine Tower of Leonia, reachable only after inverting the Grand Library at the Academy of Raya Lucaria and riding an elevator most players never think to search for, sits a small, easily overlooked item called the Curse Mark of Death. It's not a weapon or armor piece, but a key item, one whose description ties it to destined death. The ancient rune that Queen Marika's late husband Godwyn was stripped of when he was murdered. The item itself does very little mechanically, but its presence at the top of this hidden tower suggests the game's world design wanted a handful of players, and only a handful, to physically stand at the source of one of its central mysteries. Divine towers scattered across the map exist mostly to activate great runes. Functional checkpoints most players treat as errands, and it takes real curiosity to wonder whether one of them might be hiding something the others don't. The armor of a god who lost his mind. That same divine tower conceals a boss fight against a godskin noble, a corrupted priest whose set of matching armor drops after the fight ends. The Godskins sect appears throughout the game as a recurring, unsettling presence, robed figures obsessed with fire and rebirth, and finding one this far off the beaten path, guarding a tower most players never realize is climbable, reframes them as a group with far more reach than the main story ever explicitly states. The armor itself is heavy and imposing, built for players willing to trade mobility for raw physical presence, and it's the kind of set that almost nobody wears simply because almost nobody ever meets the boss guarding it. Godskin apostles reappear throughout the story wielding fire and duplication magic in equal measure, seemingly obsessed with cycles of death and rebirth, and finding a full matching set this deep into an optional tower feels like uncovering a chapter of their order. The main story never bothers to mention by name. The Sentinel's second secret. Oriza Hero's Grave hides one of the more elaborate puzzles in the entire game, a sequence involving death cart chariots that most players learn to avoid rather than ride into. But riding the third chariot correctly reveals a corpse near a ledge that, when you align yourself just right and drop, leads to an entirely separate secret room with a fourth chariot and a fire pillar puzzle. Solve it, and two chariots collide in the main chamber, granting the Tree Sentinel armor, a full set modeled after the Golden Knights who guard Limgrave's opening fields. It's remarkable how many players finish this dungeon believing they've found everything it has to offer, never realizing there was a second layer folded beneath the first. Heroes' graves in general have a reputation for this kind of layered secrecy. Dungeons that reward a first careful pass, and then reward an entirely second pass just as generously, provided you're willing to treat every corpse and every ledge as a potential clue, rather than set dressing. The axe beside the Sentinel, alongside the tree. Sentinel armor in that same hidden chamber waits the Crucible axe armor, a set connected to the Crucible Knights, an ancient order of warriors who predate the current Golden Order and whose philosophy centered on animalistic, primal strength rather than divine grace. It's reasonable to assume the Crucible Knights represent an older, rawer version of Erdtree worship, one the current religion has since buried under layers of ceremony. Finding their armor tucked behind a puzzle inside a puzzle feels appropriate for a faction the game treats as a kind of forgotten prehistory, glimpsed only by those willing to dig well past, where the obvious path ends. The Scarab in the Rot. Behind the Bestial Sanctum once more, though this time down a different set of platforms accessible from the northwest ledge. There's an entirely separate secret waiting in a location called the Abandoned Cave. Two Cleanrot Knights guard the space, elite warriors normally found only in the Haligtree far later in the game, and defeating them drops the Golden Scarab, a talisman that boosts rune acquisition from every kill. The evidence points toward this cave functioning as a deliberate early test, a chance to fight endgame tier enemies for a genuinely useful reward long before most builds are ready to handle them. Tucked into a region most players consider fully explored after their first pass, the tree branch leading to its entrance is easy to mistake for scenery rather than a bridge, and crossing it for the first time feels less like following a guide and more like accepting a dare the game never actually issued out loud. The armor worn by Knights Out of Time. That same cave and its Cleanrot Knights also drop their full matching armor set, the same regal faded gold plate worn by Millennia's personal guard deep in the Haligtree. Encountering it this early, hours before most players ever meet the Haligtree proper, creates a strange sense of foreshadowing, almost like stumbling across a photograph of someone before you know their name. The set itself carries decent poise for its weight class, but its real value is atmospheric, a hint dropped early that something significant waits for you much later. Worn by knights whose loyalty runs so deep, they'd rather die guarding a secret cave than ever leave their post. The key nobody notices they're missing. In a corner of Caelid, easy to write off as empty, an imp statue puzzle hides behind rubble that looks like ordinary environmental debris rather than a deliberate obstruction. Breaking through and solving the sequence correctly rewards the discarded palace key, an item whose sole purpose is unlocking a otherwise sealed passage deep within Landel, tied to the Frenzied Flame storyline. Without this key, an entire branch of narrative content simply stays closed off, and the game gives almost no indication that a key even exists to be found. It's the kind of item whose absence you'd never notice, since the door it opens never announces itself as locked in the first place. Rubble like this appears constantly throughout Caelid's ruined, rot-scarred landscape, and after a few hours of exploring the region, most players stop examining it closely at all, having learned that most piles of broken stone really are just piles of broken stone, except occasionally when they aren't. The needle that frees a friend. Following Millicent's questline to its end requires helping her fight through the effects of scarlet rot rather than succumbing to it, and one branch of that story rewards the unalloyed gold needle, an item whose entire purpose is undoing a curse laid on her prosthetic arm generations ago. The needle itself has no combat use whatsoever. It exists purely to complete her arc, and letting her keep the arm rather than convincing her to abandon it changes the entire trajectory of where her story ends up. It's easy to miss the significance of a plain, unassuming needle sitting in your inventory when everything else the game hands you seems built for battle. The needle meant for a goddess. Later in that same story thread, a second needle appears, this one forged specifically to counteract the scarlet rot that has consumed Malenia, Blade of Miquella, from the inside out. Miquella's needle can actually be used during the fight against her, and doing so removes her rot buildup entirely for the remainder of the encounter, a mechanical nod to just how deeply this sickness has poisoned nearly everyone connected to that bloodline. Based on what the surrounding lore implies, Miquella spent years searching for any cure to the rot eating away at his sister, and this single needle represents the closest he ever came to succeeding. Small enough to be lost entirely if you never follow the quest line that produces it. The sword bought with a broken trust. Eleonora's questline in the Altus Plateau region unfolds quietly, easy to miss if you never speak to the right characters at the right moments, and its conclusion rewards the Marais Executioner's sword, a curved blade that scales heavily with arcane and deals significant bleed damage. The weapon's design, all jagged edges and dark tarnish, mirrors the grim nature of the story behind it, one involving betrayal within a small circle of allies who trusted each other far too easily. It stands as one of the better bleed weapons available for a surprisingly long stretch of the game. Yet because its questline is so easy to walk past entirely, most Tarnished never even realize it exists. Eleonora herself is a quiet, easy to overlook character, tucked into a small camp rather than a grand location, and her entire arc unfolds through only a handful of brief conversations most players never think to revisit after the first exchange. The armor bought in blood. Volcano Manor runs almost entirely on a system of assassination contracts handed out by Recusant Bernal, and one of the later targets, a hulking enemy called the Great Horn Tragoth, drops the bull goat armor set when defeated. This is, without exaggeration, some of the heaviest and most poise-dense armor available anywhere in the game, turning even modest hits into non-events. What makes it easy to miss isn't obscurity so much as commitment. Most players never complete the full string of mana contracts required to unlock this particular target, since the earlier assassinations ask you to hunt down other Tarnished, some of whom feel uncomfortably like people rather than monsters. There's a quiet moral weight to the whole arrangement that the game never forces you to reckon with directly, and it stands to reason plenty of Tarnished. Simply stop taking contracts once the targets stop feeling like enemies, and start feeling like victims caught in someone else's war. The blade forged in the mountain. Man-serpents patrol the halls of Volcano Manor in small numbers, and a rare few of them carry a curved sword wreathed permanently in flame. The magma blade isn't particularly powerful compared to later weapons, but its drop rate is low enough that farming it becomes an exercise in patience most players simply don't have the appetite for. It's a strange little artifact, cool looking rather than mechanically essential, the kind of weapon that ends up in a chest back at your storage rather than on your belt. Kept mostly because it took genuine effort to acquire, and throwing it away would feel wasteful after everything. The armor of the man who knew everything. Sir Gideon Ofnir, the All-Knowing, spends most of the game as an ally, a scholar who seems to understand more about the lands between than anyone else you meet. Near the very end of the story, he turns on the player, forcing a fight at the Erdtree Sanctuary that many Tarnished never even trigger, since it only becomes available once you're deep into the final stretch. Defeating him drops the all-knowing armor, matching robes worn by a man whose entire character revolved around information as power. It's easy to miss simply because reaching this point requires committing to an ending path, and plenty of players finish the game entirely without ever crossing his final line. Gideon spends the whole story offering advice and context at Round Table Hold, a fixture so reliable that his eventual betrayal catches even attentive players off guard, and claiming his armor afterward feels less like looting a corpse and more like closing a conversation that had been going on since the very beginning. The robes warmed by fire. Near the Divine Tower of Kalid, a location most players approach only long enough to trigger the tower's function before leaving. Small groups of monks wander the surrounding ruins wreathed in dark flame. Killing enough of them eventually yields the Black Flame Monk armor, a set tied visually and thematically to the order of Miquella's darker, more secretive corners. One interpretation suggests these monks represent an offshoot of Miquella's more famous Golden Priesthood, twisted by exposure to Black Flame magic that the main story never fully explains. The armor's muted, ashen coloring stands in sharp contrast to the golden robes players see constantly elsewhere, a visual clue that something here has gone quietly wrong. The set earned by betraying a friend. Sorceress Selen's questline branches sharply depending on choices made along the way, and one specific outcome, siding against her former student and ending the conflict on Selen's terms, rewards Azur's Glintstone set. The robes are iconic among sorcery builds for their raw magic boosting properties, but earning them requires making a decision that quietly closes off other paths and other characters permanently. It's the kind of reward that punishes indecision. Players who try to help everyone in Liurnia's tangled web of sorcerers often find themselves locked out of this particular outcome without ever realizing a choice was even being made in the first place. Selen's story unfolds across so many small, easy-to-miss conversations, spread across dozens of hours, that most Tarnished lose the thread entirely, following whichever sorcerer they happen to speak to most recently, rather than any deliberate plan. The dagger on the rooftops, high above the streets of Lendel, royal capital, along rooftops and illusory platforms that most players never think to climb toward. A talisman sits waiting for anyone patient enough to explore vertically rather than horizontally. The assassin's crimson dagger restores health on landing critical hits, mirroring its cerulean counterpart found earlier in the Black Knife catacombs. Lendel's capital city is dense and vertical in ways the game rarely calls attention to directly, And this talisman rewards exactly the kind of aimless rooftop wandering that most players consider a waste of time once they've already found the main path forward through the city. The talisman tied to a terrible choice. Gowry, an old alchemist working alongside Millicent throughout her questline, eventually asked the player to kill her rather than help her survive the rot consuming her body. Refusing and killing Gowry instead, before you've progressed Millicent's story too far, causes his body to reveal something far stranger than expected and drops the flock's canvas talisman, an item that boosts incantation power. The choice between trusting Gory's advice or protecting Millicent from it sits quietly at the center of one of the game's more uncomfortable moral dilemmas, and the talisman itself becomes a small, permanent reminder of whichever path you chose. The recipe hidden in a killer's prayers. Mogwyn Palace, the blood-soaked throne room of Mog, Lord of Blood, hides a room most players never think to search for because the boss fight itself feels like the obvious endpoint. Behind the altar in Mog's arena, up in the rafters on a corpse easy to miss entirely, sits Frenzied's cookbook, unlocking the recipe for a Frenzy Flame stone. It's a strange thing to find tucked into the lair of a demigod whose entire identity revolves around blood rather than fire, and it stands to reason that whoever left it there was hiding from Mog himself, choosing his throne room specifically because nobody sane would think to search it. The horn that curses its bearer. Deep within Sofra River, the underground realm bathed in perpetual starlight, a talisman waits that most players who find it immediately discard without understanding what it does. The envoy's long horn raises maximum HP significantly, but at the cost of increasing the damage taken from all sources. A trade-off that feels backwards until you realize it's built for high-risk builds that stack healing and damage negation elsewhere to compensate. It's the kind of item that punishes players who don't read carefully and rewards the rare few willing to build an entire loadout around one talisman's strange, lopsided math. The insignia that rewards ruin, scattered rarely among certain enemy drops across the lands between, is a talisman whose effect only makes sense once you understand the game's status effect systems deeply. The Rotten Winged Sword insignia boosts the power of your next attack after successfully triggering a status effect like bleed, poison, or frostbite on an enemy, rewarding a very specific kind of build that most casual players never construct. Based on what its mechanics suggest, it was designed by the developers as a reward for mastering status effect timing rather than raw stat investment, which makes it functionally invisible to anyone who never dips into that side of the game's combat systems. The reward for killing what rots. Certain enemies deep in rot-infested regions, creatures already stricken with scarlet rot themselves, occasionally drop the Kindred of Rot's exaltation, a talisman that raises attack power whenever you or nearby enemies are afflicted with poison or rot. It functions almost identically to talismans earned through other elemental affinities, but its drop conditions are vague enough that most players who do eventually acquire it aren't entirely sure how they got it. This could imply the item was meant to reward sustained exposure to the game's rot mechanics specifically, a slow accumulation rather than a single deliberate quest, which makes it feel more like an accident than an achievement. The reward for surviving the feast. Bloody Finger Nerigus, an NPC invader who ambushes players deep within Mogwyn Palace, drops the Lord of Blood's exaltation upon defeat, a talisman that boosts attack whenever bleed is triggered nearby. What makes this fight easy to overlook is timing. Nerigus only appears under specific circumstances tied to progress through the region. and plenty of players clear the palace entirely without ever triggering his invasion. The talisman itself pairs so naturally with bleed-focused builds that its absence from a bleed loadout feels like an oversight. Yet a genuinely significant number of players finish the game never knowing it exists. The sword that ends an age, tucked behind one of the game's most demanding late-game questlines, involving the fire giant, Melina, and the final walk to the Erdtree itself, waits the sacred relic sword, a colossal blade that channels the burning of the Erdtree directly into its weapon art. Acquiring it requires committing fully to a specific late-game path and making choices that permanently shape how your playthrough concludes. Its size and ceremonial design reflect the gravity of the moment it's tied to, a weapon literally forged from the ashes of the game's central symbol, and its rarity comes not from being hidden in a corner, but from requiring total commitment to reach. Plenty of players finish other endings entirely, siding with Ranni or the Frenzied Flame instead, and never see the specific sequence of events that puts this particular blade in their hands, which makes it one of the few genuinely missable weapons tied not to a corner of the map, but to a decision about how the whole story ends. The curved blade that hunts the dead. Deathrite birds, tall skeletal creatures that patrol certain graveyards and ruins, rarely drop a curved sword when defeated in specific circumstances tied to their unique death animation. The Zaymir curved sword carries a passive effect connected to death itself, and its scarcity comes from the fact that most players simply kill these enemies the normal way, without realizing a rarer outcome exists. It's reasonable to assume the weapon's design was meant to reward players paying close attention to how an enemy dies, not just that it dies, a small mechanical detail buried inside a much larger, much louder combat encounter most people rush through. The rapier bathed in rot, deep within Celia's crystal tunnel, past crystalline growths and enemies that inflict scarlet rot on contact. A rapier waits that inflicts the same affliction on anything it touches. The Antspur rapier rewards a very particular playstyle. Thin blades and rapid poke damage combined with a status effect most players associate with slower, heavier weapons instead. Its location deep inside a tunnel most players only enter once, purely to reach the region beyond it, means the weapon itself often goes completely unnoticed. Sitting quietly at the end of a path most people treat as a hallway, rather than a destination worth exploring. Celia Crystal Tunnel is dense with crystalline enemies that inflict madness and rot in equal measure, and by the time most players fight their way through to the far end, the instinct to keep moving toward the exit tends to win out over any lingering curiosity about what might be sitting in the side rooms behind them. The anchor, rusted through. Somewhere within Volcano Manor's winding halls, an enemy carries a colossal weapon shaped like a ship's anchor, corroded and heavy in a way that suggests it was never meant to leave the sea. The rusty anchor deals significant strike damage and carries a unique, lumbering moveset unlike anything else in its weapon class. Its drop rate mirrors the Magma Blade's scarcity, low enough that most players who see it once never manage to make it drop twice. And its origin as an actual anchor repurposed into a weapon raises questions about exactly how far from the coast this particular man-serpent originally traveled. Man-serpents themselves appear almost exclusively within Volcano Manor's grounds, and their connection to the sea has never been fully explained, which makes an anchor turning up in their possession one of those small, unresolved details that rewards players who notice it, rather than a mystery the game ever bothers to answer directly. The staff left behind by a prince. A glintstone staff tucked away and easy to miss entirely, bears the name Prince of Death, tying it thematically to Godwyn, whose fate ripples through nearly every major plot thread in the game. This could imply the staff belonged to someone connected to his memory or his cult of followers, though the game itself never states this outright, leaving the connection as inference rather than confirmed fact. Mechanically, it boosts sorceries related to death and decay, a niche but thematically rich tool for a very specific kind of build, sitting quietly in a corner of the map, most players clear without a second glance. Godwyn's shadow stretches across so much of the game's lore, referenced constantly by other characters yet never explained in full, that finding an item carrying his title in such an unremarkable spot feels almost like the world quietly acknowledging a grief nobody wants to speak about directly. The staff that bends gravity, hidden inside a chest that requires genuine platforming to reach. The meteorite staff rewards sorcerers who invest specifically in gravity magic, a school of spells that pulls enemies downward and crushes them under sudden, immense weight. It's easy to underestimate gravity sorceries early on, since the school asks for patience and setup, rather than the instant gratification of a spell like Comet Azur. The staff's remote placement, requiring a jump most players wouldn't attempt without already knowing it's there, means it tends to stay locked behind guides rather than genuine discovery for the vast majority of playthroughs. Gravity magic in general asks players to think about positioning and setup in ways most of the game's other sorceries don't, which makes this staff feel less like a hidden weapon and more like a hidden philosophy waiting for the right kind of patient, methodical caster to actually appreciate it. The wing torn from a falling star. Astel, natural born of the void, one of the stranger and more cosmic bosses tucked underground in Nokron, rarely drops a colossal weapon shaped from what appears to be a piece of its own celestial body. The wing of Astel deals magic damage and carries an unusual, almost alien moveset that mirrors the boss's own attack patterns. Its rarity stems from a genuinely low drop chance, layered on top of an already optional boss fight many players skip entirely, since Nokron's deeper corners require specific triggers to access. Few weapons in the game feel quite as disconnected from anything human as this one does. Astel itself barely resembles a creature at all, more constellation than beast, and wielding a piece of it afterward feels like carrying around a fragment of something that was never meant to exist, within reach of mortal hands in the first place. The seal sold in shadow, hidden behind an illusory wall or tucked with a merchant, most players never think to seek out. The Golden Order seal offers a boost to incantations tied specifically to the Golden Order's own faith, the dominant religion of the lands between. It's a strange item to bury so carefully, given how central the Golden Order is to the entire narrative. But the evidence points toward From Software deliberately hiding faith tools behind exploration rather than handing them out along the main path, forcing players who want to build around incantations to actually search rather than simply follow the story forward. Faith builds in general demand more legwork early on than sorcery builds tend to. And this seal is a small, quiet example of that pattern repeating itself, tucked away, rather than handed over freely at the start of the journey. The seal worn by a fallen knight, tied to a specific side story involving the bestial sanctum and its guardian. The clawmark seal rewards players who engage with one of the game's quieter beast worship storylines, a thread that runs counter to the Golden Order's more sanitized version of faith. The seal itself boosts incantations connected to that same primal animalistic tradition, mirroring the Crucible Knights found much earlier in spirit if not in name. It's a small item with an outsized thematic weight, connecting several loose threads about older, wilder forms of worship that the Golden Order worked hard to bury beneath its own more polished mythology. The bestial sanctum itself sits well off the main road through Caelid, and most players only pass anywhere near it while chasing a completely different objective, leaving its own quiet subplot about beast worship as something you have to go looking for, rather than something the story hands you directly. The seal buried in gravel. A less discussed seal exists tucked away from a hidden merchant most players never bother speaking to at length, the gravel stone seal, boosting incantations tied to lightning and thunder specifically. Its obscurity comes less from a difficult location and more from simple oversight. The merchant selling it offers a long list of items, and most players skim past entries that don't immediately catch their eye. This could imply the developers intentionally buried certain tools inside long, unglamorous vendor lists specifically to reward players patient enough to actually read every line rather than scroll past them. Merchant menus in this game rarely announce which items are rare and which are common, treating a seal that only exists in one place with the exact same plain text formatting as a crafting material you'll find 50 of, which flattens the sense of discovery unless you already know to be looking closely. The stone older than the kingdom. Scattered in vanishingly small numbers throughout the world, ancient dragonsmithing stones are required to upgrade a small category of weapons tied to dragon worship and ancient pre-Erdtree magic. One sits hidden in a corner of crumbling Farum Azula that requires precise platforming most players never attempt, since the ruined, collapsing architecture of that region discourages careful exploration in favor of simply surviving it. Based on what the surrounding lore suggests, these stones predate the current era of the Lands Between entirely, remnants of a civilization that worshipped dragons long before the Erdtree ever took root. Crumbling Farum Azula exists partly outside of normal time, its architecture folding in on itself in ways that make simple platforming feel treacherous, and it stands to reason that a resource this old would end up hidden somewhere the rest of the world has quite literally left behind. The final stone, Somber Smithing Stone 9, exists in the entire game as a genuinely limited resource, with only a small handful of copies available across an entire playthrough, tucked into locations that range from difficult to nearly incidental. Reaching the maximum upgrade level for certain weapons requires tracking down every single one, a task that turns naturally curious exploration into something closer to a scavenger hunt. It's easy to assume, incorrectly, that smithing stones simply become common the deeper you get into the game, and players who make that assumption often find themselves several stones short, right when they need them most. The gap between an 8 and a 10 on a favorite weapon can feel enormous in late-game combat, and discovering you're missing the final stone with no easy way to farm more has a particular way of souring an otherwise triumphant playthrough. The route that pays for passage, Death Route, dropped by a select few unique and often optional enemies, functions less like a traditional crafting material and more like a toll. Certain hidden doors throughout the world, most notably within the death-touched catacombs, demand a payment of Death Route before they'll open at all, and the amount required is steep enough that casual exploration rarely accumulates enough by accident. It's reasonable to assume this system was built specifically to gatekeep certain rewards behind sustained boss hunting, rather than simple wandering. Since accumulating enough loot means deliberately tracking down enemies, most players only fight once out of narrative necessity. Most players clear their required story bosses and move on without a second thought, never circling back to farm the same fight again, purely for a resource that, at first glance, doesn't seem to do very much of anything at all. The door that demands a sacrifice. Behind that same locked door, within death-touched catacombs, waits the ash of war called Unsheathed, a skill that channels a sudden, devastating draw/attack. The 8 death root required to open the door represents one of the steepest single item tolls in the entire game, and the dungeon itself sits far enough off the beaten path that most players never even discover the locked door exists, let alone realize what waits behind it. This could imply the developers wanted this particular skill reserved specifically for players deeply invested in hunting down the game's rarer, more dangerous enemies. The seal marked for death. Radagon's Scar Seal offers one of the strangest trade-offs in the entire game, raising every one of the wearer's core stats significantly, while simultaneously slashing damage negation by more than a third. It's the kind of item that looks appealing in a menu and terrifying in actual combat, and its niche use case, mostly speedrunning or extremely aggressive glass cannon builds, means most standard playthroughs never touch it at all. Tucked away in a corner of the map that offers little other reason to visit, it sits waiting for the rare player willing to trade survivability for raw, reckless power. Its very name ties it to Radagon himself, the god warrior who married into the royal family and later becomes one of the final bosses, and equipping it feels almost like borrowing a piece of his own dangerous, all-or-nothing philosophy towards strength. The talisman of an older war. Near the resting place of the fire giant, one of the game's largest and most punishing boss encounters, a talisman called the Old Lord's Talisman waits nearby, tied thematically to an era of giants and older gods that predates the current royal family entirely. Its effect boosts the power of skills that consume stamina heavily, a niche but potent tool for aggressive skill-based builds. Most players who reach the fire giant are focused entirely on survival, and the area surrounding the fight rarely gets a second look once the boss itself finally falls, leaving this talisman waiting patiently in a battlefield everyone assumes has already given up everything it has. The giant himself is one of the largest bosses in the entire game, and the sheer relief of finally bringing him down tends to override any lingering curiosity about what else might be scattered across the scorched ground he leaves behind. The sword sold by Wandering Feet, a specific nomadic merchant, one of many scattered across the world selling wares from a small cart, occasionally offers the ritual sword talisman for purchase, an item that boosts attack power for a short window immediately after using any consumable item. It's a talisman built specifically around aggressive, consumable heavy playstyles, and because it's tucked into a merchant's inventory rather than a dramatic dungeon reward, it tends to get overlooked entirely by players who assume the most valuable items only ever come from combat or exploration, rather than simple commerce. The medallion that roars, hidden within the divine tower of West Altus Plateau, accessible only after specific story progress unlocks the path. The roar medallion boosts the power of skills that involve a roaring or bellowing animation, a strangely specific category that includes several colossal weapon arts. Its location inside a divine tower, structures the game treats as ceremonial checkpoints rather than treasure vaults, means most players climb up, interact with whatever the tower's main function is, and leave without ever checking the surrounding chamber for anything else worth taking. Divine towers rarely reward exploration beyond their central purpose, and after visiting several without finding anything extra, most Tarnished simply stop looking, which is exactly the kind of habit this particular tower quietly punishes. The charm forged in fire. Somewhere within the volcanic reaches of Mount Gelmir, a hidden chest holds the Fire Scorpion charm, a talisman that boosts fire damage negation specifically. Mount Gelmir's terrain is aggressively vertical and covered in hazards, lava flows and falling rocks that discourage the kind of slow, careful searching that finds hidden chests in the first place. Most players who traverse the mountain are simply trying to survive the trip from one side to the other, and the charm sits waiting in a location that rewards exactly the opposite instinct, patience over urgency, in a region practically designed to punish patience. Between the lava flows and the sheer, crumbling cliff faces, Mount Gelmir has a way of turning even confident players cautious, and that caution rarely leaves room for the kind of unhurried searching that would actually turn up something like this charm. The wheel that rolls through bone, a colossal weapon shaped like an enormous spinning wheel. The geezer's wheel deals significant damage through sheer momentum, rolling forward in a manner unlike almost anything else in its class. It's dropped rarely by specific enemies within Volcano Manor's grounds, and its unconventional moveset means even players who do acquire it often set it aside in favor of more traditional colossal weapons. The evidence points toward this being one of the more experimental weapon designs in the game, built to reward players willing to relearn how a colossal weapon can move, rather than simply how hard it can hit. Most colossal weapons in the game favor slow, deliberate swings that telegraph their damage well in advance, and a wheel that keeps rolling forward after the initial swing breaks that pattern in a way that takes real practice to use effectively, rather than clumsily. The sword sold in silence. A hidden merchant tucked away from the main paths of Volcano Manor sells the coded sword, a curved weapon whose passive properties reward players investing in dexterity and arcane simultaneously. Its price is steep enough that many players who do stumble across the merchant choose to spend their runes elsewhere first, only to forget the sword exists by the time they've accumulated enough currency to return. It's a small, easily missed casualty of the game's economy, an item lost not to obscurity of location, but to the simple human tendency to prioritize immediate needs over items that can always be bought later. Runes in Elden Ring feel precious right up until the moment you have thousands sitting unused, and by then most players have already forgotten which merchant, tucked away in which corner of which manor, was once selling something worth a second look. The dagger with no name attached. Another hidden merchant offers the dagger of Milos for purchase, a small blade whose passive effect ties into poise damage rather than raw stats, making it a strange situational pick for players focused on staggering enemies quickly rather than simply outdamaging them. Its obscurity comes largely from how narrow its use case is. Most build guides never mention it, most players never seek it out, and it exists almost entirely as a curiosity for players deep enough into experimentation to be hunting for tools nobody else is using. The sword that flows like water. Deep within Noxtella, Eternal City, home to the Nox, a subterranean race whose civilization the main story only ever brushes against. A rare enemy called a Nox swordstress occasionally drops the Nox flowing sword, a curved blade with an unusually fluid, almost dance-like moveset. It's reasonable to assume the Nox developed combat styles entirely separate from the surface world, isolated for generations underground, and this weapon reflects that isolation in its very animation, moving in ways nothing else on the surface quite matches. Noxtella itself feels like a city preserved mid-collapse, grand architecture frozen under still, dark water. And finding a weapon this elegant amid so much ruin says something quiet about who the Nox were before whatever catastrophe drove them into hiding. The helm that hides a face. Nox monks, spell-casting enemies found in the same subterranean ruins, rarely drop the Nox mirror helm upon defeat. A hood that boosts intelligence and grants a passive effect connected to sorcery casting. Its reflective, almost mask-like design mirrors the secrecy that seems to define the Nox as a people, hidden away from a surface world that mostly forgot they ever existed. Because Noxtella itself sits deep underground, past several layers of exploration most casual players never bother completing. This helm remains one of the rarer pieces of armor most Tarnished never see even in passing. The Nox monks themselves cast slow, deliberate spells from a distance, easy enough to avoid entirely if you're simply trying to reach the region's boss, which means plenty of players walk past several of them without ever provoking a fight at all. The halberd shaped like water. A pole arm with an unusual wave-like blade profile. The ripple crescent halberd drops from the same Nox sword stress enemies scattered through Noxtella, carrying a weapon art that sends a rippling wave of force outward with each swing. Its scaling favors dexterity and intelligence together, an uncommon combination that appeals to a narrow slice of hybrid builds. Most players exploring Noxtella are focused on finding the region's key items and moving on quickly, given how disorienting and maze-like the ruins can feel. Leaving weapons like this one to gather dust in a chest nobody thinks to open twice. Its weapon art sends that same rippling wave through water and open air alike, and testing it out in the flooded chambers scattered throughout the ruins reveals a small, satisfying detail most players never think to check for themselves. The rod carried by a deathbird, southeast of the southern Aeonia swamp bank in Caelid. A deathrite bird waits, but only after nightfall, invisible and unfightable in daylight hours the way so many of the game's nocturnal threats are. Defeating it drops Death's Poker, a greatsword that channels ghost flame through a barbed, almost ceremonial rod, rather than a conventional blade. Its description ties it to the deathbirds themselves, described as graveyard firekeepers, who rake the ashen remains of the dead from their kilns, which could imply these creatures serve some quiet, unglorified funerary role scattered across the world, rather than existing purely as obstacles. Most players who explore Caelid during the day never realize this particular fight even exists, since resting at a site of grace specifically to wait for dusk is a habit few Tarnished develop this early into a playthrough. The Spear of a Fallen Rival. Vike, an NPC invader who appears as a hostile phantom in the mountaintops of the Giants, drops his signature weapon upon defeat, the Vike's War Spear, a polearm infused with frost damage and a unique weapon art. Vike's backstory ties into themes of pride and rivalry among the Tarnished. Warriors who once sought the Elden Ring for themselves and lost. Fighting him feels less like a scripted boss and more like an ambush, and plenty of players who do encounter him are too focused on survival to fully register what they've earned once the fight ends. NPC invaders like Vike have a way of appearing suddenly, without warning music or a dramatic cutscene to signal their importance, and it's easy to mistake one for a random hostile phantom rather than a character carrying his own small piece of the world's larger story. The light soul below the world. Deep within the Ainsel River, an underground waterway connected to Siofra River's broader network, a hidden merchant sells the Discus of Light, a throwing weapon that deals radiant, light-based damage from range. It's an unusual choice for a merchant tucked so far underground to be selling something themed entirely around light. And one interpretation suggests this contrast was deliberate, a small ironic detail buried in a place the sun never reaches. Most players moving through Ainsel River are chasing the region's boss and its key items, leaving merchant inventories as an afterthought easy to skip entirely. Nomadic merchants across the game tend to blend into their surroundings. Cloaked figures crouched beside small campfires that look, at a glance, like just another piece of underground scenery, rather than a shop worth stopping for. The statue given in trust, as part of Ranni the Witch's questline, delivering the Fingerslayer blade eventually leads to receiving the Carian inverted statue, an item meant to be handed off to Seluvis, another of Ranni's servants, as part of a task that ends up revealing something deeply unsettling about his true intentions. The statue itself functions as a plot device more than a combat tool, and its significance only becomes clear in hindsight once the fuller shape of Seluvis's schemes becomes apparent. It's the kind of item players carry for a while without understanding its weight, until the story finally explains itself. Seluvis presents himself throughout as a harmless, almost comic figure hiding in a tower full of dolls, and the slow reveal of what he actually intends to do with the statue. This innocuous is one of the quieter, more unsettling turns buried inside Ranni's otherwise hopeful storyline. The ring that ends an age of stars, completing Ranni's full quest line through to its conclusion, rewards the Dark Moon Ring, a key item tied directly to one of the game's several possible endings, the Age of Stars, where the Elden Ring is remade under Ranni's quiet, distant rule. Reaching this point requires an enormous amount of careful, specific quest line progress, spread across dozens of hours, and a significant number of players who start Ranni's story never actually see it through to completion, missing both the ring and the ending it represents entirely. Ranni herself frames this ending as a quiet, deliberate rejection of the current order, a small and distant new beginning, rather than a grand, triumphant one. And the ring itself carries that same understated weight, cold and pale in a way that suits her personality precisely. The robes of a broken kingdom. On a corpse northeast of the abandoned coffin's site of grace in western Altus Plateau, among a procession of wrecked carriages that most players glance at once before moving on, waits the ruler's set, robes tied to the fallen royal family and their slow, tragic collapse. The imagery surrounding the abandoned coffin itself, carts still loaded with the dead, suggests a hurried, desperate evacuation that never reached its destination. Based on what the scene implies, whoever these robes belonged to died alongside everyone else in that convoy. Another quiet tragedy folded into the game's much larger story of a kingdom falling apart. The scene itself never explains who exactly was being transported or why, leaving the wrecked carts to speak for themselves, and it's the kind of environmental storytelling that rewards the specific player willing to slow down and actually read a battlefield rather than simply loot it. The Robes of Quiet Study, Stillwater Cave in Liurnia of the Lakes, hides the sage set among its damp, narrow passages, robes associated with careful, methodical magic use rather than raw offensive power. The cave itself is easy to miss, tucked away from Liurnia's more prominent landmarks, and its narrow, winding layout discourages the kind of quick exploration most players default to. It stands to reason this set was placed deliberately in a location that mirrors its own thematic identity, a quiet, unassuming space rewarding patience over speed, much like the sorcery styles the robes were designed to support. Liurnia is dotted with dozens of small caves like this one, most containing little more than crafting materials, and it takes a certain stubbornness to keep checking every single one on the assumption that this particular cave might be different from the last 20. The robes soaked in sanguine, dropped by the sanguine noble, an enemy encountered in the frozen expanse of the consecrated snowfield. The sanguine noble said carries a blood-red colouring that stands out sharply against the surrounding white. Based on the enemy's design and placement, this could imply a connection to Mohg's bloodline or influence extending further into the world than the main story ever directly confirms. The consecrated snowfield itself requires the same two-part medallion needed to reach the silver scarab talisman mentioned earlier, meaning this set shares its obscurity with several other items clustered in the same remote, frozen corner of the map. Visibility out here is poor at the best of times, snow blowing sideways across a landscape that offers few landmarks to navigate by, and it's easy to walk right past an enemy encounter entirely, while squinting through the storm, looking for the region's main points of interest instead. The armor sung into being. Deep within the ancestral woods of Siofra River, an ancestral follower, Shaman occasionally carries the chest and leg pieces of a set that most players only ever see from a distance, since these enemies tend to keep their range and cast rather than close in for melee. The Shaman set favours intelligent scaling, oddly enough, for armour worn by a creature that looks more tribal than academic. Its headpiece drops separately from a different Shaman singing quietly in the small ruins north of the woods, a detail easy to miss since most players kill the first Shaman they see and assume the fight is over. You have probably heard that eerie, wordless singing drifting through the trees before you ever spotted where it was coming from. And there's something unsettling about realizing the melody belongs to the very enemy you're about to fight. The ancestral woods themselves feel deliberately disorienting. Tall trunks and drifting fireflies that make it easy to lose your bearings. And tracking down both halves of this set means resisting the urge to simply push forward toward whatever landmark you're actually trying to reach. The robes left in a frozen study. Renna's Rise, tucked away in northwestern Liurnia, holds more than the ladder up to Ranni's Tower that most players associate with it. Progress her quest line far enough, and a chest appears on the upper floor at the back of the lift, holding the Snow Witch set. Robes that echo Ranni's own pale, wintry aesthetic. It's easy to assume this small tower has nothing left to offer once you've climbed past it toward the main story beats, and plenty of Tarnished do exactly that, walking straight past a chest sitting quietly behind them the entire time. Ranni's Tower functions almost like a way station in most players' minds, somewhere you pass through on the way to somewhere more important, and that framing alone is probably why this particular chest goes unclaimed by so many people who technically walked right by it. The robes from somewhere else, buried deep underground in a side room marked by a large orange glow that most players mistake for just another environmental light source. The Traveler's set waits for anyone curious enough to actually investigate. Its design looks distinctly foreign compared to the armor native to the lands between, all wrapped cloth and worn leather in a style that suggests its owner came from somewhere the story never bothers to name. One interpretation suggests this set belonged to a wanderer from beyond the borders entirely, a quiet nod to the idea that the world of Elden Ring is larger than the map itself ever shows. Underground rooms like this one rarely announce themselves as worth exploring. Tucked away from any marked path or objective, and finding this particular glow requires a specific instinct to treat every unusual light source as a question rather than simply scenery lighting the way forward. The robes of a loyal sorcerer, Rogier, an ailing sorcerer who spends much of the early game recovering at Round Table Hold. eventually gives up his own Spellblade set once his brief, melancholy questline reaches its end. He's easy to miss entirely if you never speak to him more than once, since his dialogue trickles out slowly and his physical presence in the world outside Roundtable Hold is limited to a single, quiet appearance. Losing him without ever noticing his questline existed means losing both his rapier and his robes in one overlooked stroke. A small tragedy tucked into a corner of the game most players never linger in long enough to catch. Roundtable Hold is packed with NPCs, offering just enough dialogue to feel like background color, and it takes real patience to keep returning to each one after every major story beat, checking whether their words have quietly changed since the last visit. The robes of a silent war between the east and west windmill pastures. An enemy called a battle mage occasionally drops the full battle mage set upon defeat. Hooded robes built for casters who'd rather fight up close than hide behind distance. It's an unusual design choice for the game to make. Robes meant for melee adjacent spellcasting, rather than the usual safe distance most sorcery builds prefer. And finding a full matching set feels almost like discovering the game had an entire hybrid playstyle in mind that most builds never bother exploring. The windmill pastures themselves are easy to treat as empty grassland between more interesting locations, and it takes a certain restlessness to actually engage every enemy patrolling the open fields, rather than simply riding past them toward the next landmark. The robes that remember a traitor. Inside the fortified manor in Lendel Royal Capital, the main hall holds the full Albric set on display rather than hidden away, though its central location paradoxically means plenty of players walk straight past it while focused on other objectives inside the manor. The name Albrich carries weight in the broader mythology this game draws from, and finding a set bearing that name tucked into a manor most players clear quickly for its more obvious rewards feels like brushing against a reference the story never fully explains. The fortified manor itself sits along the way to more pressing objectives within Lendel, and its main hall, despite being lit and easily accessible rather than hidden, still manages to slip past players focused entirely on the capital's larger, more dramatic set pieces. The robes worn in a crowd. Wandering nobles occasionally travel in large groups across the Altus Plateau, and defeating enough of them can yield the full aristocrat set. Robes distinguished by their ornate, faintly mocking elegance. Most players who encounter these groups are focused on survival rather than loot, since a crowd of hostile nobles tends to overwhelm quickly if you're not careful, and the armor drop becomes almost an afterthought, buried beneath the relief of simply having won the fight. Altus Plateau's open roads make these encounters feel almost incidental. Groups of enemies you stumble into while riding towards somewhere else entirely, and the armor they leave behind rarely gets a second thought once the immediate danger has passed. The armor left in the dark. 2 pieces of the blood-soaked set lie scattered on the ground within the subterranean shunning grounds near the underground roadside site of Grace, in an area most players treat purely as a thoroughfare toward the region's boss. The armor's dark stained coloring suggests violence long since past, and its placement on the bare ground rather than in a chest gives it an oddly forgotten quality, as though whoever wore it last simply never got back up. The shunning grounds are lined with similar small, unexplained scenes like this one, scattered remains that hint at struggles the game never bothers narrating directly, and most players moving through toward the region's boss have little reason to slow down and read the story written into the ground itself. The set given by a grieving sister, fear, a quiet blind woman who wanders a round table hold offering unsettling embraces to Tarnished nearing death, eventually rewards her twin set to those who follow her fragmented, sorrowful questline through to its end. It requires giving her a weathered dagger and eventually finding Dee, her half-brother, in the room past the blacksmith, a sequence of connections most players never think to draw between two characters who seem, at first, entirely unrelated. Her story is one of the quieter tragedies in the game, easy to miss, because so much of it depends on noticing small details, rather than following an obvious quest marker. Fear rarely leaves her small corner of Round Table hold, and her invitations to embrace her feel unsettling enough that plenty of players avoid engaging with her at all, never realizing that accepting what looks like a threat is actually the first step toward one of the more emotionally rewarding storylines tucked into the game. The Mask of a Hollow Rival, an NPC invader called Bloody Finger Okina, ambushes players near the Church of Repose in the mountaintops of the Giants, and defeating him drops the Okina mask, a distinctive piece that stands out from the armor most enemies in this frozen region wear. Okina's design and fighting style feel almost out of place this far from anywhere else in the game, and it's reasonable to assume he represents some kind of wandering outsider, much like the Traveler's set found elsewhere. Someone whose story the game only ever gestures at through appearance rather than explanation. NPC invaders in the mountaintops of the Giants blend easily into an already hostile frozen landscape, and Okina's ambush can feel like just another dangerous encounter rather than a character carrying a name and a mask worth remembering afterward. The robes collected from the faithful. Inside the Church of Inhibition in Leonia of the Lakes, a corpse holds the complete Finger Maiden set, robes worn by the servants of the two fingers who guide Tarnished toward becoming Elden Lord. The church itself is small and easy to overlook, amid Leonia's sprawling lake and academy, and its interior offers little indication that anything valuable waits inside beyond the usual scattering of grace and crafting materials most small churches provide. Leonia holds dozens of these minor churches scattered across its waterlogged fields, and after visiting a handful that offer nothing more than a sight of grace, most players stop bothering to check the rest closely, assuming correctly more often than not, which makes the exceptions easy to miss entirely. The medallion below the capital. Deep within the subterranean shunning grounds beneath Lanedell, extensive exploration eventually leads to the Cerulean Amber Medallion, a talisman that raises maximum stamina. The shunning grounds themselves stretch on for a genuinely long time, filled with poison and rot that discourage thorough searching, and most players who reach the region's end are simply relieved to be finished, rather than inclined to backtrack for anything they might have missed along the way. Stamina rarely gets the same attention players give to health or damage output, and a talisman built entirely around it tends to slip past builds that never think to prioritize something so unglamorous over a flashier alternative. The reward for a wandering warrior, Iron Fist. Alexander, a good-natured Jar warrior who rolls his way across the entire map over the course of the game, eventually rewards the Shard of Alexander to Tarnished, who help him along his journey and see it through to a satisfying conclusion. He's easy to lose track of, since his location changes constantly, and missing him at any single point along his path can end his story early. The talisman itself, boosting the power of skills, feels like a fitting gift from a character defined almost entirely by his own weapon art. Alexander's cheerful, booming voice makes him one of the more memorable side characters in the game. which almost makes it more surprising how many players still lose track of him somewhere between his early, stuck in a hole moments and his eventual, hard-won conclusion. The shard from his earlier days. Before reaching his full potential, Alexander occasionally drops the warrior jar shard during an earlier, more perilous stretch of his journey. A smaller talisman tied to the same skill-boosting philosophy as his later reward. Missing this earlier moment doesn't necessarily end his story, but it does mean losing a piece of his tale that most players who rush through his questline in a single sitting never even realize exists, tucked between his more memorable, more dramatic appearances. There's a particular satisfaction in tracking a wandering NPC across dozens of hours and multiple regions, checking back in whenever you happen to pass somewhere he might have rolled to next. And this smaller shard rewards exactly that kind of patient, ongoing attention. The book Guarded by Dogs, a small ruined house within dragon-burnt ruins in Limgrave, holds the second deserter's cookbook, guarded by a pack of dogs and rats that make the tiny space feel more dangerous than its size suggests. Cookbooks in general occupy a strange place in most players' priorities, useful but unglamorous, and this particular one sits in a location most Tarnished visit once for the ruins' more obvious rewards before moving on entirely. Dragon-burnt ruins earns its name from the scorched, broken landscape surrounding it, and the small house holding this cookbook is easy to mistake for just another piece of that same wreckage, rather than a structure worth stepping inside. The recipe for sleep. Inside Stormfoot catacombs, tucked near a staircase not far from the entrance, sits the first Fever's cookbook, notable for unlocking the recipe for a sleep pot, a consumable that induces the sleep status effect on enemies. There's something quietly fitting about a recipe for sleep hiding in a dungeon. Most players clear in a hurry, distracted by the imp infestation and the flame pillar trap waiting further in, never slowing down enough to notice the corpse holding it. Stormfoot Catacombs punches well above its weight for such an early dungeon, and surviving its gauntlet of imps tends to consume every bit of attention a new Tarnished has to spare, leaving little room to notice a recipe book resting quietly near the stairs. The Book of Exalted Flesh. Northeast of Agil Lake North, a small camp holds the Armorer's Cookbook, whose sole recipe produces exalted flesh, a consumable that grants a temporary boost to physical attack power. 2,000 runes feels like a genuine investment early in the game, and plenty of players hesitate to spend that much on a single recipe book, walking away to save their runes for leveling instead, and simply forgetting to circle back once they've earned more. Agil Lake draws most players' attention toward the dragon patrolling its waters, rather than the small camps scattered nearby, and a cookbook sitting quietly among crafting supplies rarely competes for attention against a genuine dragon breathing fire across the horizon. The recipe, passed between soldiers. Nomadic warriors' cookbooks appear scattered across several regions, often on the bodies of former merchants who seem to have once traveled the same roads their living counterparts still walk. The recipes they unlock tend toward practical battlefield-ready items, arrows and simple bolstering consumables rather than anything flashy, which might explain why so many players collect them without ever fully appreciating how much they quietly support a sustained fight. There's something almost melancholy about finding these recipes on the very merchants who once sold similar goods while alive, a small detail suggesting the roads of the lands between were never particularly safe, even for those who made their living traveling them. The second gift, from an old friend. Patches, the game's recurring trickster merchant, eventually sells the second missionary's cookbook once his own small questline progresses far enough, unlocking recipes tied to holy water and gold-pickled preservation. Patches has a way of vanishing and reappearing across the story in ways that make his full inventory easy to miss. And players who only ever interact with him once or twice rarely realize how much more he has to offer given time and patience. He relocates his shop entirely at certain points in the story, and Tarnished, who assume they've already seen everything he's willing to sell, often never think to track down where he's moved to next. The Book of Fragrance. Somewhere in the lands between, a perfumer's cookbook waits to unlock recipes tied to perfume bottles, consumable items with area effects that most players underestimate simply because they don't function like a typical weapon. Perfumers as a group appear scattered throughout the story in small, often tragic roles, and their cookbooks carry a certain quiet artistry that gets lost among the game's louder, more combat-focused rewards. Perfume as a weapon category asks for a completely different mindset than swords and spells, area denial and status effects rather than raw damage, and most players never invest the time needed to appreciate what these recipes actually add to a fight once mastered. Building an entire loadout around scattered clouds and lingering effects takes a patience closer to gardening than swordplay, which might explain why so few Tarnished ever bother learning the craft properly. The first book of the Frenzied. Inside a house on the western side of Frenzied Flame Village, in Leonia of the Lakes, a corpse holds the first Frenzied's cookbook, unlocking the recipe for clarifying boluses, a consumable that cures madness buildup. The village itself radiates a quiet dread even before you understand what's happened there, and most players move through it quickly, eager to leave rather than search every house for what might be hiding inside. Frenzied Flame Village carries an atmosphere unlike almost anywhere else in Leonia, still and wrong in a way that makes lingering feel actively uncomfortable, which is exactly why so many players hurry through without checking the corpse tucked inside its western house. The Rapier of a Grateful Scholar. Roger's questline, mentioned earlier for its armor, also rewards Roger's rapier upon its conclusion, a thin blade that carries the Carian retaliation weapon Art, built for punishing enemies who attack while you're guarding. It's a fittingly clever weapon for a character defined by intelligence and careful study, rather than brute strength, and its absence from most players' inventories says less about the weapon's quality and more about how easy Roger's entire presence in the story is to overlook. His questline unfolds through a handful of conversations spread out across the early and middle game, and letting too much time pass between visits to Roundtable Hold risks missing the specific window where his story quietly concludes. The Blessing of a Fading House. Completing Afir's questline in full, rather than abandoning it partway through, eventually grants the Radiant Baldaquin's blessing, an incantation tied directly to her strange, sorrowful role among the dead and dying of Roundtable Hold. It heals allies in a considerable radius, a generous spell born from a character whose entire purpose seems to revolve around offering comfort to Tarnished, who have given up hope of ever becoming Elden Lord. Fyr's incantations feel distinct from the Golden Order's usual healing magic, softer and sadder somehow, and learning them requires trusting a character most players initially approach with real suspicion, given how she introduces herself. The rune left by a dying prince. At the very end of Fyr's story, assuming you see it through with the right choices along the way, she offers the mending rune of the Death Prince, a rune that restores health and stamina to unusually generous levels whenever you rest at a site of grace. The name ties it directly to Godwyn once more, another quiet thread in the game's ongoing preoccupation with the prince whose death set so much of the story's tragedy into motion, and receiving it from fear specifically feels like closing a circle the game never explicitly draws for you. The talisman behind the bookcase. Within the storehouse, first floor site of grace in Shadow Keep, a talisman waits behind a bookcase that most players walk straight past without realizing it can be interacted with at all. The Boldrake talisman raises lightning damage negation, reachable by jumping down from the level above rather than approaching it directly, and its location behind ordinary-looking furniture is exactly the kind of detail that separates players who scan every room carefully from those who move through looking only for the obvious path forward. Shadowkeep is dense with rooms stacked on top of each other in ways that reward vertical thinking, and a bookcase that looks purely decorative from one angle turns out to be hiding a passage the moment you approach it from above instead. The talisman on the water's edge, a wooden platform beside the northernmost house of the abandoned Ailing village in the north of Gravesite Plain, holds the ancient talisman, raising the power of attacks made with both hands on a weapon. The village itself carries a haunting, waterlogged quality, and most players passing through are focused on surviving whatever threats lurk in its flooded streets, rather than checking every platform along the water's edge for something easy to miss in the gloom. Gravesite Plain sets an ominous tone right at the start of the expansion, and the abandoned Ailing village in particular carries a sense of dread thick enough that most Tarnished are eager to press forward, rather than pause to examine every wooden structure along the shoreline. The talisman of every crucible, south of the ancient ruins of Ro, past a jump down from the Church of the Bud that most players never think to attempt, a hidden chest holds the talisman of all crucibles, an item that grants the combined effects of every other crucible talisman found throughout the expansion. Reaching it requires a specific sequence of jumps and passages that feels closer to platforming than exploration, and it stands to reason this was meant as a reward specifically for players thorough enough to have found the individual crucible talismans first. The ancient ruins of Ra sit at the edge of the expansion's map, and the sheer distance required to even reach this area means plenty of players never make it out this far in the first place, let alone attempt the specific jump sequence waiting once they do. The discus at the statue's feet, in the east of Rao ruins, reachable only by taking a teleporter west of the high road cross site of Grace. The verdigris discus sits at the foot of a statue beyond a horned knight enemy easy to mistake for an unbeatable guardian. It raises defense the higher your equipment load climbs, a niche but genuinely useful talisman for heavily armored builds, and its location past an intimidating enemy means plenty of players turn back before ever reaching the statue itself. The horned knight guarding this stretch of ruins fights with a patience and precision that catches underprepared Tarnished off guard, and the instinct to retreat rather than push through it is a reasonable one, even if it costs you a talisman, waiting quietly just beyond. The necklace sealed in a chest, somewhere in the southern reaches of the shadow of the Erdtree map, a chest holds the mottled necklace, upgraded to its second tier, granting improved full damage negation. It's an unglamorous effect on paper, easy to dismiss compared to flashier offensive talismans, but the difference it makes during the DLC's frequent vertical exploration is significant enough that most players who skip it never realize how many fools it could have softened along the way. Shadow of the Erdtree leans heavily on vertical level design compared to the base game, cliffs and rooftops, and precarious ledges everywhere you look, and a talisman built specifically to soften that risk feels almost essential in hindsight for anyone who spent the expansion falling more than they intended to. The Medallion of Endless Stamina. Within Darklight Catacombs in Skadu Altus, hugging the right side of the starting railings before dropping down to a broken path below, the Viridian Amber Medallion waits in its third tier, offering the largest stamina boost of its kind. Darklight Catacombs itself is easy to underestimate as just another minor dungeon, and the chest holding this medallion sits close enough to the entrance that impatient players sometimes miss it entirely on their way toward the boss further in. Darklight Catacombs itself is easy to underestimate as just another minor dungeon, and the chest holding this medallion sits close enough to the entrance that impatient players sometimes miss it entirely on their way toward the boss further in. The armor of an ancient order. That same Darklight Catacombs holds the Death Knight armor set early within its passages, a set that could imply a connection to the capital's ancient dragon-worshipping cult, given how its passive effect enhances skills and incantations tied to that same tradition. Finding armor this thematically dense in a dungeon, most players treat as a quick early detour, speaks to how much lore Shadow of the Erdtree tends to bury in places that look, at first glance, entirely unremarkable. Based on what the item's design suggests, the dragon cult referenced through this armor connects back to threads the base game only touches briefly, and encountering a fuller expression of that worship this early into the expansion rewards players who treat every catacomb as a potential lore drop, rather than just another quick farming spot. The cookbook carried by a mariner. East of Charo's hidden grave, a Tibia mariner drifts along the river on its slow, mournful boat, and defeating it drops Tibia's cookbook, unlocking the recipe for a consumable called Call of Tibia. Tibia mariners appear as recurring, almost ceremonial enemies throughout the expansion, boats carrying the dead down quiet waterways, and it's easy to sail right past one without realizing it carries anything worth stopping the boat for. Their slow, mournful movement across the water gives them an almost peaceful quality compared to most of the expansion's more aggressive threats, and that same peacefulness is probably why so many players choose to avoid provoking them rather than seeking them out for a fight. There's a certain reluctance built into approaching a funeral boat with violence in mind, even in a game that rarely asks players to hesitate before drawing a weapon. The cookbook of a wandering cult. Scattered across several locations within the Land of Shadow, the Saint Trina Disciples Cookbook unlocks recipes tied to the sleep-inducing flowers associated with Saint Trina, a figure whose worship threads quietly through several corners of the expansion. The cult itself never receives a fully explained backstory, existing mostly through implication and scattered item descriptions, and its cookbook feels like one more fragment of a religion the game trusts players to piece together on their own. Saint Trina herself appears throughout the expansion as a quiet, sleep-associated presence, and her followers' recipes carry that same drowsy, half-dreaming quality, consumables that feel less like tools of war and more like offerings left for a goddess who never fully wakes. The Cookbook of a Faithful Guard. Inside an armory tucked below the Castle Ensis checkpoint site of Grace, a chest holds the Loyal Knight's Cookbook, its recipes tied to the steadfast, sworn defenders of Castle Ensis. The armory itself is easy to walk past while focused on the castle's more prominent threats, and the cookbook waiting inside rewards players willing to poke into every side room rather than beelining straight for the next boss encounter. Castle Ensis presents itself as a straightforward, linear fortress at first glance, and it takes a deliberate effort to break from that linear instinct and start checking the smaller rooms tucked just off the main corridor. Most castles throughout the game reward exactly this kind of detour, a habit that takes real discipline to maintain once a boss door is already visible up ahead. The Talisman from the river's depths. Within Rivermouth Cave, reached by heading northeast from Elec River and locating a waterfall concealing an entrance behind it. The two-headed turtle talisman waits for anyone willing to get their boots wet. It reduces stamina consumption from a variety of actions, a quietly useful effect for aggressive playstyles, and the cave's location behind a waterfall means most players who ride past never realize there's anything to find behind the falling water at all. Waterfalls, throughout the Land of Shadow, have a habit of concealing passages the game never marks in any obvious way, and the specific instinct to ride straight through falling water rather than around it is one most Tarnished never develop, until well after they've already passed several such openings by. There's something almost ritualistic about the moment a player finally learns to distrust every waterfall on principle, checking each one from then on regardless of how many times the habit turns up nothing. The sting that waits in silence. A talisman called Arrow's Soaring Sting rewards players who invest in range combat, boosting the power of bow and crossbow attacks fired from a distance. Its placement within the Land of Shadow rewards patient exploration off the main road. And because ranged builds already represent a minority of playthroughs, this talisman tends to go unnoticed twice over, first by players who never explore far enough to find it, and second by players who wouldn't have equipped it anyway. Bow-focused builds have always occupied an unusual niche in this game, powerful but demanding in ways melee combat isn't, and talismans built specifically to support that playstyle tend to sit unclaimed, simply because so few Tarnished ever commit to arrows as a primary strategy. Ranged combat asks for a patience most players never develop, content to close the distance rather than hold it. And this talisman waits quietly for the rare few who feel otherwise. The blade behind the grave. Northeast of the scorched ruins, a mausoleum holds the backhand blade, a weapon notable for its ability to split apart and fight as dual blades rather than a single unified sword. Its weapon art executes a quick sideways stab that catches enemies off guard, and the mausoleum housing it carries the same quiet, funereal atmosphere found throughout much of Gravesite Plain, easy to walk past while focused on louder, more obvious threats nearby. Mausoleums scattered across the Land of Shadow tend to hold significant rewards precisely because their grim, unassuming exteriors discourage casual investigation. And this one is no exception. Sitting quietly northeast of a ruined area, most players have already decided holds nothing else worth their time. The blade's ability to split apart mid-combat surprises even players who fought against it, let alone the ones who simply never think to check whether a stone building tucked among the graves might be worth entering at all. The sword, along the cliff's edge, travelling northeast from the Cerulean Coast site of Grace along a genuinely precarious path, careful players eventually reach the Starline Sword, a weapon whose design echoes the celestial themes running throughout so much of the game's mythology. The path itself discourages casual exploration, narrow and exposed with real consequences for a careless step, and it's exactly the kind of route most Tarnished glance at once before deciding the risk isn't worth whatever might be waiting at the end. The Cerulean Coast offers gorgeous, sweeping views that tend to pull a player's attention outward toward the horizon, rather than downward toward the precise placement of their feet, which makes the narrow cliffside path leading to this sword feel more like an afterthought than a deliberate destination. Falling from that height means losing the climb entirely and starting over from the bottom, a cost steep enough that plenty of players simply decide the view alone was worth the trip. The tear that steadies the body. somewhere near the site of an early encounter with a furnace golem, a Viridian hidden tear waits to improve stamina recovery, once slotted into a flask, though acquiring it means putting yourself at odds with a genuinely dangerous early boss. Most players would rather avoid provoking unnecessarily. The trade-off between risk and reward here feels deliberate, a tear worth having, but not worth chasing carelessly, tucked into a fight that punishes impatience severely. Furnace golems hit like walking siege engines, and most Tarnished who stumble into one early tend to retreat rather than press the fight, which means the tear waiting nearby often stays unclaimed simply because the encounter guarding it feels unreasonable on a first attempt. Coming back later with a stronger build changes the calculation considerably, though by then plenty of players have simply forgotten the golem was ever guarding anything worth returning for. The tear found in the lowest waters, near the lowest section of Elec River, another crystal tear waits quietly among the reeds and shallow water, the Crimson Burst dried tear, which grants a burst of healing when consumed alongside a flask. Elec River winds on for a considerable stretch, and its lowest reaches are easy to skip entirely if you're following the main path toward the region's more prominent landmarks, rather than tracing the water all the way down. Rivers in this game rarely reward players who stick to the banks, and the specific habit of wading into the shallowest, least dramatic-looking stretches of water is one that separates thorough exploration from the kind most players default to without thinking twice. A burst of healing tied to a flask feels almost like a small luxury compared to the game's more standard gradual restoration, and finding this tier rewards exactly the kind of unhurried, curious wading most Tarnished never bother with. The Talisman. Waiting on a rooftop. Within the scorched ruins, following a path across the rooftops that most players only discover by accident, a chest holds the Blade of Mercy talisman, raising the power of critical hits performed from stealth. The climb itself is guarded loosely by apparition enemies easy enough to avoid, and the chest sits at the top almost as a quiet reward for anyone curious enough to keep climbing after the ground level has already offered up its more obvious treasures. Rooftop exploration rewards a specific kind of restlessness, the sense that a ruined structure's true secrets live above rather than below, and the scorched ruins seem built almost deliberately to punish players who never look up from the streets. Critical hits from stealth already carry outsized value against unaware enemies, and stacking a talisman built specifically around that mechanic rewards a patient, predatory approach most players abandon the moment combat actually begins. The Arts of a Wandering Teacher, Dryleaf Dane, a blind, barefoot martial artist who appears early in the Land of Shadow, eventually teaches the Dryleaf arts to Tarnished, who follow his gentle philosophical questline through to its conclusion. His fighting style relies entirely on bare hands and claws rather than traditional weapons, a genuinely unusual choice for a build, and his teachings feel like a reward specifically for players patient enough to sit through his quiet, meandering conversations, rather than skip past them toward louder rewards. Dane's dialogue unfolds slowly, full of philosophy and half-remembered wisdom that rarely announces its own importance, and it takes real restraint to keep speaking with him past the point where most players would assume there's nothing left to say. He teaches without ever quite lecturing, and the martial art he passes on feels earned in a way few other combat styles in the game manage to replicate. The robe and hat of a humble master. Completing Dane's full questline also rewards his signature Dane's hat, alongside the matching Dryleaf robe, simple, unassuming garments that stand in sharp contrast to the ornate armor most late-game rewards tend toward. There's something fitting about a character who teaches humility through combat, ending up with armor that reflects that same philosophy, plain cloth over gleaming plate, easy to overlook on a shelf crowded with far flashier options. Dane and his teachings represent one of the more contemplative corners of the expansion, a break from the grim, war-torn tone that defines most of the surrounding region, and his simple garments carry that same quiet contrast with them. The longbow, taken from a bitter ally, Sir Ansbach, a disillusioned former commander who wanders the land of shadow offering cynical commentary on the war unfolding around him, eventually loses his bow and the rest of his equipment when Needle Knight Leder hunts him down. A fate players can choose to help bring about by assisting her over him. Ansbach's longbow itself carries a weapon, art suited to sustained, patient engagements, fitting for a character whose entire outlook has curdled into weary pragmatism after years of conflict most players only glimpse second-hand through his bitter remarks. Choosing to side with Leder against him means his own separate quest line, and whatever rewards it might otherwise have offered closes permanently the moment he falls. He speaks less like a soldier proud of his cause and more like a man exhausted by having chosen a side at all. And that exhaustion colors every conversation you have with him from the very first meeting, right up until the one where you decide whether he lives to finish his own story or becomes someone else's. The greatsword of a grieving knight, Freya, a knight whose story unfolds quietly across the land of shadow, eventually rewards Freya's greatsword to those who help her through her own difficult quest line. A weapon whose size and weight suit her steadfast, sorrowful character. Her story intersects with several other threads in ways easy to miss if you're not paying close attention to which NPCs reference each other in passing conversation. And losing track of the connections means losing track of when and how to actually trigger her rewards. The Land of Shadow weaves its side characters together far more tightly than the base game ever did. And Freya's arc in particular depends on catching small references most players skim past without registering their significance. The shield that guards a promise. Alongside her great sword, Freya's questline also offers the Golden Lion Shield, a round shield whose passive properties favor defensive, patient combat over aggression. It pairs naturally with her greatsword despite the mismatch in scale, suggesting a fighting style built around absorbing blows before answering with overwhelming force. And the shield's understated design belies just how much protection it actually offers once properly upgraded. Freya's equipment as a whole tells a quiet story about restraint and patience. A knight who would rather endure than strike first. And the shield captures that philosophy just as clearly as the greatsword it's meant to complement. Very few of the game's paired weapon and shield combinations feel this deliberately matched in temperament rather than simply in visual style. The Sword of a Divided Loyalty. Leder's questline, tangled up with the larger conflict between the Hornsent people and their oppressors, eventually rewards Leder's sword depending on which side of that conflict you choose to support. The choice itself carries real narrative weight, and most players who make it without fully understanding the stakes involved find themselves locked into a path they didn't entirely mean to commit to. Discovering the consequences only well after the decision can no longer be undone. This particular conflict never frames one side as obviously righteous, and the sword you end up with says as much about which perspective you found more convincing in the moment as it does about the weapon's actual stats. The armor worn in Divided Loyalty. That same choice also yields Leder's armor, matching gear that reflects her own conflicted position within a war that predates the player's arrival by generations. Her story functions almost as a smaller mirror of the larger themes running through the entire expansion. Questions of loyalty and inherited conflict, and her armor carries that weight quietly, easy to acquire without fully understanding everything it represents. The Land of Shadow returns again and again to the idea of loyalty passed down rather than freely chosen. And Lada's entire arc distills that theme into a single, compact questline most players finish without realizing how much larger a shadow it casts across the rest of the expansion's central conflict. The Blade of a Broken Alliance, choosing to help Needle Knight Lada against Hornsent rather than defending him, yields the Falx, a pair of curved swords tied to the culture of the Hornsent people he represents. It's a strange, almost uncomfortable reward, earned by turning against a character many players had already grown to sympathize with over the course of the Land of Shadow's central conflict, and the weapon itself carries that discomfort in its very acquisition, a blade taken rather than freely given. Hornsent spends much of his presence in the story, offering a perspective the game rarely grants its more monstrous-looking characters, and choosing to strike him down rather than protect him feels less like defeating a villain and more like siding with the version of history that already had the upper hand. The talisman earned through betrayal. In a separate confrontation later in the Land of Shadow, Needle Knight Lada turns her attention towards Sir Ansbach himself, and helping her hunt him down rather than defending him, yields both his equipment and afterward the retaliatory cross-tree talisman from Lada directly, boosting counter-attack damage in a way that feels thematically appropriate for a fight born from turning on an ally rather than simply encountering an enemy. Its acquisition marks the permanent end of Ansbach's own quest line, and whatever rewards he might have offered otherwise, a door closing the moment this one opens. Talismans, earned through helping hunt down a former ally, carry a particular weight in this game, small trophies that only exist because a friendship was severed rather than sustained, and equipping one afterward means carrying that history along with it. The skill earned through the opposite loyalty, choosing instead to defend Hornsent when Lada comes for him, rather than helping her, ends her pursuit of him early and rewards the Ash of War. Swift Slash along with Lada's rune, though it also closes off the later chance to fight alongside Ansbach in her name. The symmetry between these two mutually exclusive confrontations reflects how deliberately the expansion builds its side characters around genuine, consequential choices, rather than simple binary good and bad options. Neither Ansbach nor Hornsent presents themselves as clearly right or wrong, and the game seems content to let players sit with the discomfort of choosing one over the other, rather than offering any tidy resolution. The Mask, taken from a wise man, helping Lada hunt down Sir Ansbach, also yields the wise man's mask among the rest of his equipment, a helm reflecting his identity as a scholar turned soldier, weary from years spent watching conflict consume people he once respected. Wearing it afterward feels like carrying a small piece of his disillusionment forward, a physical reminder of a story that offers no clean resolution, regardless of which side you ultimately support. Ansbach's mask, once claimed, sits strangely among a player's collected armor, a keepsake taken from someone whose reasoning you may have understood perfectly well, even as you chose to end his story anyway. The Mask, taken from a silent ally, helping Lada against Hornsent instead, in the earlier of these two confrontations, yields the Caterpillar Mask among his effects, tied visually and thematically to his own people's distinct insectoid culture within the Land of Shadow. The mask's unusual design stands apart from most of the expansion's more conventional armor. A small visual reminder of just how different the Hornsent people are from anything the base game ever showed players about the wider world beyond the Erdtree's reach. Hornsent culture threads through the entire expansion as a genuinely alien counterpoint to everything established in the base game. And small details like this mask do more to build that sense of otherness than any single line of dialogue ever manages on its own. The armor forged in devotion, Fire Knights, elite soldiers encountered within the deeper reaches of the Land of Shadow, occasionally drop their full matching armor set upon defeat. Robes and plate fused around a devotion to flame that runs through much of the expansion's imagery. They're tough, deliberate fighters, and most players who face them are focused entirely on survival rather than considering what they might be carrying. Leaving the set as a reward reserved specifically for those who take the fight seriously enough to actually win it cleanly. The imagery of flame recurs constantly throughout the Land of Shadow in ways both reverent and dangerous, and finding a knightly order built entirely around that devotion feels like one more piece of a puzzle the expansion never fully assembles for you. Their armor carries scorch marks and soot woven right into its design, a small detail suggesting these knights wear the evidence of their own devotion rather than simply representing it symbolically. The armor bound by curses. Within the Curseblade Labyrinth, a maze-like dungeon that disorients even careful players, the Curseblade set waits at the end of a genuinely challenging gauntlet. The labyrinth's design deliberately works against a player's sense of direction, and simply reaching the armor requires a level of patience most Tarnished run out of well before they ever see the reward waiting at its center. Labyrinths like this one appear scattered throughout the expansion as a distinct dungeon type, favoring confusion over direct combat difficulty, and the frustration of losing your bearings repeatedly tends to push players toward giving up long before curiosity would otherwise carry them through to the armor waiting patiently at the far end. The head taken from a dancing beast, defeating the divine beast. Dancing Lion, an early and genuinely strange boss encountered atop Belurat, rewards its remembrance alongside the divine beast head, a helmet crafted from the creature's own skull that boosts strength, dexterity, and the power of storm-based incantations at the cost of reduced healing from flasks. The lion's design, equal parts elegant and unsettling, carries over into the trophy it leaves behind, and fighting it for the first time without any prior knowledge tends to leave a lasting impression, precisely because nothing about it resembles the more conventional bosses found throughout the rest of the game. Its bladed limbs move with an almost musical rhythm during the fight, drawing on a ritual dance the game's own item, descriptions tied to a festival long since turned toward war. And Belurat as a whole sets an unusual tone for the expansion's opening hours, closer to theater than warfare. In a way, this boss encapsulates better than almost anything else found within its walls. The fragment taken from a sleeping giant, defeating the golden hippopotamus, a boss easier described than believed until you actually see it, rewards a Scadutree fragment among its other drops, one of 50 scattered throughout the Land of Shadow that quietly determine how much damage you deal and receive within the DLC. Most players discover their damage output feels insufficient long before they realize just how many of these fragments exist to be found, tucked into corners far less obvious than the story's main path ever suggests. Frustration with a sudden difficulty spike often sends players searching guides rather than exploring further on their own, and there's a quiet irony in the fact that the solution to that frustration was sitting the entire time in exactly the kind of overlooked corner those same guides are built to reveal. The hippopotamus itself feels almost comically out of place among the expansion's more traditionally grim enemy roster, and defeating it tends to leave players more amused than triumphant. The blade taken from a winged terror. Twin gargoyles occasionally guard specific corners of the map, and defeating them can yield a gargoyle's black blade, a curved weapon carrying a passive effect connected to poison. The fight itself demands careful attention to two coordinated enemies rather than one, and most players who survive it are simply relieved the ordeal is over, rather than inclined to examine every item that dropped in the chaos afterward. Twin boss fights ask for a completely different rhythm than solo encounters, splitting attention in ways that leave little room for anything beyond pure survival. And sorting through the loot only really happens once both gargoyles are finally still. The poison the blade carries mirrors the coordinated, patient way these gargoyles fight together, a small mechanical echo of the very enemy it was taken from. The torch that burns with ghosts. A ghost flame torch waits to be found or purchased for those pursuing an incantation-focused build centered on ghost flame, a spectral variant of fire tied to specific, unsettling corners of the world's mythology. It's a weapon defined almost entirely by its unusual visual effect, pale flame, rather than the familiar orange most fire weapons carry. And its niche appeal means it tends to stay overlooked by players who never venture into ghost flame incantations specifically. Ghost flame as a concept sits at the edge of the game's broader mythology, tied to spectral, half-remembered things, rather than the more straightforward fire magic most faith builds default to. And committing to it means embracing a stranger, less conventional path than most players ever consider. The torch's pale glow stands out sharply against the warmer, more familiar firelight found almost everywhere else in the game. A visual cue that something about this particular flame doesn't quite belong to the living world. The allies bound in Twin Study. Within Black Knife Catacombs, the same dungeon that yielded Rose's axe and the assassin's talismans mentioned earlier, a third and final secret waits behind its main boss, the Cemetery Shade. Defeating that boss drops the Twin Sage sorcerer Ashes, a spirit ash that summons two sorcerers who fight together, casting glintstone spells in tandem, rather than relying on any single powerful ally. Finding a third distinct reward tucked inside a dungeon, most players consider fully looted. After clearing its first boss speaks to just how densely From Software tends to stack its smaller locations. Black Knife Catacombs in particular rewards thoroughness in a way few other minor dungeons do, layering a talisman, a key item, and a spirit summon across a single, compact space that most Tarnished assume has already given up everything it has after just one careful sweep. The ashes of a healer who failed, deep in the unsightly catacombs on the Altus Plateau. A duo fight waits at the very end of the dungeon, Perfumer Trisha standing alongside a misbegotten warrior she supports with her aromatics. Defeating her drops the Perfumer Trisha ashes, a spirit summon that lets you call her spectral aid into your own fights afterward. Her own description casts her as a healer who once dedicated herself to treating misbegotten and omen, the outcasts and impure that the Golden Order's society had no place for, staying with them as they died so that none of them had to pass alone. It's a strange, quietly tragic backstory to find buried at the bottom of a catacomb. Most players clear purely for the fight itself, and summoning her afterward means carrying a piece of that gentleness into battles she never would have chosen for herself. The crest of a falling tower. Within the Divine Tower of Leonia, alongside the Godskin Noble encounter and the curse mark of death mentioned in Part 1, a talisman called the Carian Filigreed Crest also waits to be claimed, reducing the FP cost of skills for anyone patient enough. To search the tower thoroughly rather than leave immediately after the main encounter concludes. Its presence here means this single hidden tower quietly holds 3 separate, genuinely valuable rewards. A density of secrets that most players never fully appreciate having only visited once. Reducing the cost of skills matters more than most players realize once a build leans heavily on weapon arts rather than spells, and a talisman this useful hiding in the same tower as a boss fight, and a key story item feels like the game rewarding thoroughness with more thoroughness still. It's the kind of layered design that only reveals itself fully in hindsight. Once you've pieced together everything a single hidden location was actually holding. The favor owed by the Erd Tree. Scattered across the world in its various upgraded tiers, the Erd Tree's favor talisman boosts a combination of maximum HP, stamina, and equipment load simultaneously, making it one of the more broadly useful talismans in the entire game, despite how easy its higher tiers are to miss. The highest version tends to hide in locations demanding real commitment to reach, and plenty of players carry an early, weaker version for the entire game, without ever realizing a significantly better one exists somewhere they simply never explored. There's a particular kind of quiet regret in finishing the game and later learning your favorite talisman had a stronger version waiting the entire time. Tucked into some corner of the map, you'd already decided held nothing left worth finding. Talismans that scale across multiple tiers like this one reward exactly the kind of obsessive, repeated exploration most players reserve only for their very first playthrough, if at all. The seal sold to the faithful. A dragon communion. Seal waits among the wares of a specific merchant or hidden location, tied to the game's dragon communion incantations, boosting the power of breath attacks channeled through draconic magic. Dragon worship threads through the world in scattered shrines and altars most players visit briefly before moving on. And this could suggest the seal rewards the rare Tarnished who commits fully to that particular, unusual school of incantations, rather than treating it as a passing curiosity. Dragon communion incantations demand real investment in a build that most players never fully commit to. Breath attacks that feel more like a novelty than a core strategy for anyone who hasn't built specifically around them. And this seal exists quietly for the handful who did. The dragon shrines scattered throughout the world offer just enough of a taste of this playstyle to intrigue curious players without ever fully explaining how deep the tradition actually runs. The pustule that remembers a prince. Deep within Deeproot depths, alongside Death's Poker mentioned earlier in tonight's journey, a hidden item called the Prince of Death's Pustule waits tucked away from the main path. A crafting material tied once more to Godwyn's lingering presence throughout the game's underground spaces. It's fitting, in a way, that so many small fragments of his memory end up scattered through the world's deepest, most overlooked corners, as though even the lands between itself struggle to let him go entirely. Deeproot Depths as a whole feels less like a dungeon and more like a memorial. Roots and silence stretching in every direction, and finding one more trace of the prince buried this far from anywhere else feels less like discovering loot and more like stumbling across a quiet grave nobody thought to mark. There's a particular stillness to this part of the map that nothing else in the game quite matches, and it seems almost intentional that so many of Godwyn's remaining fragments were scattered here specifically, in the one place built entirely around the idea of something ancient still growing beneath the surface. Roots, by their very nature, reach downward and outward in directions nobody can fully map, and there's something quietly appropriate about a prince's memory being kept alive, not in a shrine or a tomb, but in the tangled, unseen structure, holding the whole world together from below.